ready.
Button underneath the table there.
Oh, there it goes. Is everything green? Yeah. Ready to go, huh?
There's a little button underneath the table you can push.
It shuts everybody off.
There's your favorite time to push.
Oh, I think that gets the sheriff or something. That's maybe a panic button. Are we ready? Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Placer County Planning Commission on this May 9th. We're going to start out by having a flag salute. And oh, here comes another Richard. Why don't you lead us in the salute to the flag, Richard?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Roll call.
Mr. Nader?
Here.
Mr. Moss? Here. Mr. Johnson?
Here?
Mr. Rakucci? Here. Mr. Denayo?
Here.
Mr. Sevison?
Here.
Mr. Gray?
Well, it appears we have enough people to carry on a meeting. Is there a report from the planning director this morning?
There is, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of items to update your commission on. County Counsel, Deputy County Counsel Karen Schwab could not be here today, so we have the County Counsel, Jerry Carden, with us. A couple of items that the board took action on this past Tuesday. The board unanimously approved the landscape design guidelines that were previously considered by your commission. And there was the third-party appeal of the biomass facility. After receiving comments from the appellant, staff modified 7 conditions of approval that the appellant concurred with, and that appeal was denied, but the project was approved with the new conditions of approval, and that satisfied the issues raised by the appellant. Just an update for you, there is a May 23rd Planning Commission hearing, and at least one of the items that will be on that will be the proposed Alpine Coaster project up at North Star. And that concludes staff's comments.
Any questions of staff on any of the comments? None. Thank you. At this point, we usually have public comment for any folks in the audience who would care to address the Planning Commission on items not on the agenda. So we would be happy to have you come forward and address us and tell us your issues if there is some. Seeing no one coming forward, we'll move on then to the workshop. And I guess we can thank George Rosasco for leading us in this.
Yes.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you, Commissioner Sevenson?
Oh, perfect.
Good.
Well, close.
Don't modify it.
So today we are here to conduct a public workshop to obtain direction on developing criteria and standards for the review of community centers before the end of the 45-day moratorium that was recently imposed by the Board of Supervisors on community centers. I do want to, so we all know what we're talking about when we say community centers, I do want to read the definition quickly. Community centers means multi-purpose meeting and recreational facilities typically consisting of one or more meeting or multi-purpose rooms, kitchen and or outdoor barbecue facilities that are for use by various groups for such activities as meetings, parties, weddings, receptions, dances, etc., and includes Grange halls. It's a very broad definition, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later in my presentation. By way of background, starting in 2012, when some of the community centers that are now been approved, Wise Villa Community Center, Gold Hill Gardens Community Center, we started hearing from the public. They began voicing concerns that the community center entitlements that were being requested in conjunction with wineries specifically, and when I say wineries, there's 2, and then there's Gold Hill Gardens that does not have a vineyard at this time, were attempts to circumvent what a community center actually was supposed to be as provided in the zoning ordinance. So to address those concerns, the plan director, who is also the agency director, Michael Johnson, wrote an interpretation that all community centers would not be heard by the zoning administrator, they'd be heard by the planning commission, so that there would be a higher level of scrutiny and review. So as we move forward in time, we went to a lot of MACs and heard concerns from community members about what was happening with community centers. And then after the processing of the Gold Hill Gardens and Wisevilla Winery, on April 9th, 2013, the Board of Supervisors imposed a 45-day moratorium on all processing of any community centers that were in process that weren't complete, or any new community centers that came in. So what I'd like to do now is I would like to just briefly go over my staff report. Well, not so briefly. I'd like to go a little bit more in depth and briefly. So you have a sense of the issues that are surrounding the processing of community centers. And this is all kind of an accumulation of about 1.5 years of hearing people talk to us about it, going to a lot of MACs. You know, it's a culmination of what came out of the Gold Hill Gardens hearings. It's a culmination of what came out of the Wisevilla Community Center hearings. First, you have a section about general plan policies. We have 10 policies in the Placer County General Plan that specifically could be related to the community center processing issue. Several of them deal with the protection of ag land and making sure you have buffer zones and that sort of thing when you put dissimilar agricultural use in an agricultural zone. Then we have several that talk about we should consider using, we should consider allowing recreational uses, commercial uses, industrial uses in agriculturally zoned land, as long as it bolsters and plays into agricultural production. There is one policy that states we should look at recreational opportunities in agricultural lands so that a farming operation could be used year-round, just not for the time of crop production, which gives farmers an alternative source of revenue. Some of those uses in the past have been they lease out for hunting clubs, they lease out duck blinds, and some things like that. That's what we've seen in the past. Moving on, I did want to briefly touch on two of the recently approved community centers went before the Agricultural Commission. One was the Wisevilla Community Center, which was supported by the Ag Commission, based on their finding that they thought that community center would support and bolster the agricultural use on site. Then Gold Hill Gardens also went to the Ag Commission. The Ag Commission did not support Gold Hill Gardens. They thought that it was strictly a community center, or as they referred to it, like an event center with no predominant agricultural use, and they did not think that was appropriate in agricultural lands. Then you would move on to a discussion of issues. I've put the issues in that section that essentially speak to the main topics that I've heard repeatedly voiced over the last 1.5 years. The first one is the definition of community center. There is a lot of comments that the community center definition is way too broad, that it should be divided into maybe 2 definitions. I put down 2 possible definitions. It's not meant to be what we're proposing. It's just to give you a sense of what you could or couldn't do. Instead of having the broad definition of community center that we have now, you could have a community center that means a government or nonprofit facility consisting of multi-purpose rooms, recreational facilities, typically consisting of 1 or more meeting or multi-purpose rooms. An example of that would be like a Grange Hall would be a community center. A community center could be as different as if you lived in a subdivision and there was like a clubhouse meeting area and it had a pool. It would be a place where the community goes. That's their public house. They have their HO meetings. There may be events there, but it's mostly community centered. And then you would have a second definition that is strictly a for-profit gathering place where people go to have events of every kind, weddings, parties. It's not specifically directed at the community in which it's in. It's available to everyone for a gathering place. The reason that you might want to consider doing that is because that allows you to look at zone districts where these might be appropriate or inappropriate with more specificity. I would tell you, based on our community zone, community center definition, by nature, because it's so broad, it covers a lot of zone districts, and most of that is controlled with a use permit. For instance, community centers are permitted by right in all commercial zoning districts, the highway service zoning district, and the resort zoning district. They're conditionally permitted in all residential zone districts and office park zone district, and the farm zoning district with the approval of a minor use permit. So because of the broad definition, it covers a lot of zoning designations, and that we in the past have looked at those uses with a use permit to make a case-by-case basis. So that's with regard to the definition. The next thing that we have heard a lot about is that people think that we might want to consider putting much more specific regulations on community centers. And in my staff report, I call that performance criteria. A performance criteria is essentially a specific regulation or standard that needs to be met by ordinance. For instance, I gave some examples in my staff report. You might want to establish a minimum size that a community center or an event center would be allowed on. You might want to establish standard hours of operation, maximum number of events. You might want to establish a distance, like you can't have a community center next to each other. They can't be in more than a half-mile radius from each other. You might want to establish minimum access standards. So that's what a performance criteria is. The advantage of performance criteria is it's very it's right out there. It's like if you don't make these standards, you don't get to move forward in the process. The disadvantage to that is that we live in a very diverse county, and we are not like within a city jurisdiction that's much more homogeneous. So when you start putting in those standards, you lose discretion to say that you might have something that's non-standard that doesn't meet performance criteria, but may be appropriate. And that could be handled now through the use permit process. So there are advantages of having performance criteria, and there are disadvantages. But that's something we wanted you to be aware has come up on numerous occasions. The other option that I put in discussion of issues is it is possible for you to decide that our process is exactly the way it should be. The definition of a community center is fine, and that the use permit process that we have employed works just the way it should, and we're not going to do anything. That's also a possibility. So we thought it would be helpful for you to know how other counties that we thought were similar in nature in certain ways to Placer County are dealing with the issues that we're dealing with. So the first one we looked at was Amador County. Amador County has what I would say is sort of the situation that we may have in this county 20 years from now. They have a lot of wineries. They have a lot of events in agricultural areas. It's interesting to note that they don't allow a community center type use in their agricultural zone district. They do allow events at wineries to the tune of, if you're a winery, you can have an unlimited number of events of 125 people or less. If you want to go above 125 people, then you need a use permit. That's all regulated through a winery ordinance. They do allow an event center or community center use in their commercial zone districts subject to design review. Bed and breakfasts may have weddings with a use permit, and they do allow what would be another kind of gathering place like fraternal lodges, union halls, that sort of thing. and they allow all of that with a use permit in any zone district, and they look at it based on its merits. The next county we looked at was Sonoma County, which the reason we looked at that is because we figured that they would have a handle on how they dealt with all these things, because they have a lot of events with regard to their wineries in rural areas. So what I was able to ascertain from them is, in the unincorporated area, they have approximately 400 wineries that exist right now. And every one of them, according to the planner I talked to, wants to have events. So they have taken the approach that they don't have a winery ordinance or anything of that sort or nature. They simply say, if you're a winery in an agricultural area and you want to have events, you will go through the use permit process, and we will review you based on your merits. I think they've had some of the same problems that we would encounter with trying to put in performance criteria and that sort of thing. They don't have any performance criteria. I do know that they have some, I'm not sure if they're written policies, but the planner that I talked to made me acutely aware that Sonoma County is not receptive to allowing events in a winery that is on a private road. She said that she could guarantee that that would be a recommended no on the use permit from staff, but as we know, that can go up to the commission and the board of supervisors, which may be reversed. So that was one of the things that she wanted to make very clear. They do have a similar use to an event center or community center. However, they only allow those in their commercial zone districts, and specifically the commercial zone districts that are most near main arterials in the county. She said they had quite a bit of zoning that allow event centers or commercial conference kind of centers, like along 101 and other main arterials throughout the county. The other thing I wanted to throw in, and this is, oh, I'm sorry, I thought I heard something. The other thing I wanted to put in was that I did ask them what kind of complaints, and I asked every county I talked to, what kind of complaints are you receiving with regard to all these things going on? And the response I got was fairly amazing, because it could have come from any member of the public in Placer County. They all echoed the same concerns. The concerns were amplified music in a rural area, people driving on unfamiliar country roads that are not lit and they don't know, with a high likelihood that they may have been drinking. They're very concerned about that. And that was fairly consistent across the board with all the counties. The one thing that did come up with regard to Sonoma County that they reported, that due to the large amount of events that they have going, that it has become a real traffic problem in their county on weekends in the spring and the summer, that it's having an effect of localized traffic jams in a lot of places based on the amount of events that are happening. So they're working on systems to deal with that and kind of spread that out. The most sophisticated county that we talked to was Santa Barbara County, and the reason we talked to them is they have a lot of agricultural land. You wouldn't think so, but they do. And they did a comprehensive rewrite of their entire ordinance in 2007. Excuse me. And what they did when they started dealing with the community center issues, they actually split it out into 3 definitions. They split it out into community center, meeting facility, public or private, and conference center. To give you an idea, a community center, as I understood it talking to the person I was talking to at Santa Barbara County, is like what I described as like an actual community center. A Grange Hall, not a Grange Hall in this case, is more like the one I described about a clubhouse in a subdivision. It's definitely community-based. It's where people do their community activities. Really, it might be available occasionally to someone not in that community, but not normally. So that's a community center. Then they have meeting facilities, public or private. That's kind of like the next step up. It includes religious institutions, churches, civic and private auditoriums, Grange halls, union halls, meeting halls for clubs and other membership organizations. And then you have a conference center, which is essentially just a full-blown anything goes kind of gathering place, from huge conference centers to event centers to wedding gardens, that sort of thing. It is interesting to note that they also don't allow these uses in their agricultural zone districts. They do allow events, but it is regulated through their winery ordinance. And they have a very sophisticated winery ordinance that I won't go into, but your events that you're allowed to have are predicated on the size and the production of wine that you have. So, I think I've touched on most things relatively briefly. I know there's a lot of information. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to interrupt me. We did receive, I'm not sure how many letters we received at this time. I think we're probably at 5 or 6 comments, public comments, 5 or 6. In conclusion, I attached a timeline so you have an idea of where we're going with regard to community centers if we're given direction to continue forward. It starts out with today, workshop before the Planning Commission on May 9th, and then it goes through several workshops, and then it ultimately culminates with board consideration of a draft zoning text amendment on November of 2013. So it's a fairly aggressive schedule. In that timeline, we talk about, coming to you for 3 workshops. We talk about going out to the municipal advisory committees, bringing the ZTA back after the max, letting you look at it and revise it again, and then coming back to you for approval and then to the board. So it's a fairly intensive process. There is a lot of time for public input. There's a lot of time to vet it and get it exactly right before it ever gets before the board. One last thing I should leave with you in closing. As you can tell from my staff report, I've talked a lot about events and wineries and that sort of thing. Well, the counties that I surveyed, 2 of them have a winery ordinance, Amador and Santa Barbara, but Sonoma does not. We also have a winery ordinance, and that is also going to be reviewed and looked at on a parallel track. It might even take a little bit of a head start on community centers as we move along. So you understand there are common issues, and they will cross paths occasionally. At this point, because of the dissimilarity in a lot of cases, we're trying to keep them on separate tracks. At some point, we understand that we may have to merge them and have, discuss them together. But right now, that is our intent. Did you have any questions?
Any questions? George? Yes. Richard?
Yeah, just a couple questions that are in reference to the current ordinances that we have in the county. Mm-hmm. And I remember a few years ago, there was a proposal to put a fairly large concert-type center out somewhere around the dump area. And ultimately, it was built up in Yuba County, I think largely because of the controversy here in Placer County.
Yes.
But I guess it's kind of a question of scale in the current ordinances. Was that really being looked at under the community center ordinance, or how was that being looked at?
No. If I remember right, I think you're talking about Bill Graham Presents Amphitheater.
Yeah.
About 15 years ago. I was actually the project planner on that. I'm lucky. I actually know the answers to these.
Okay.
I believe it was done under outdoor rec commercial. It was a huge amphitheater. It was going to go out off of Athens Road, not far from the landfill, not very far from where the casino is now. On the other side of the road, out. We were looking at it. We went through. We actually issued a draft EIR in a record amount of time because the county was very much in favor of this. There was a lot of opposition that was received from specifically, what's the retirement, the retirement community in Roseville that was relative? Sun City. Thank you. The name escaped me. Sun City. So they had a huge sound test at night. I mean, cranked it up louder than it would ever be, and shot cannons off and did all these sorts of things. And the noise turned out not to be a problem. But ultimately, Bill Graham, because of their perceived opposition, and we did have actually town hall meetings at Sun City, which I was at, they moved on. They didn't have they didn't think it was going to be worth their while to stick it out.
Okay, so that would, something like that wouldn't be
Under the
In all the
community center?
zoning that a community center?
No,
it would have
that
to
would
be
be like, it was like a huge sports venue.
Okay,
it
so it'd be specific to a certain type of zoning?
Absolutely. It would be outdoor commercial recreation. I could tell you, I don't have my zoning laws in front of me. I don't remember, because that property is development reserve, industrial development reserve. I don't remember if we had to process a zoning text amendment, a rezoning or not. Don't recall that at this point.
Okay, that's probably close enough of an answer. I'm just thinking of scale as we work through this process. We're going to have to somehow deal with scale.
No, I don't think that that would be the scale of a community center
Okay.
or event center.
Another thought that comes up is frequently golf courses have a clubhouse type arrangement where they serve as a community center type venue. I think the Ridge would be an example of that, though they have a restaurant probably, but right now it's served primarily as a community center. So golf courses, do they fall under this particular text, or do they where they have a community center set up?
No, generally they do not fall under a community center. Generally, they are looked at in conjunction with, again, sometimes rural recreation, although that's more like hunting, fishing, but commercial outdoor recreation. Generally, they are looked at on a case-by-case basis. You look at the area that they're proposing, the clubhouse and that sort of thing. Sometimes an example might be Winchester. I'm not sure if we zoned the area that contains the Winchester Country Club differently from the rest of the subdivision, but it's looked at it in that sort of venue, from an outdoor commercial recreation sort of.
Okay, and those could be approved in the farm zone without a zoning change?
I don't know if you can do golf courses in the farm zone. I believe that I'm trying to think if you can or not. Let me grab my.
Okay, well, maybe
Okay,
you
wanna
can
come
come
back
up
to
with these
that?
answers at a later time.
Yeah, yeah.
We're going to have 3 meetings to go through this.
Yeah,
These are just
absolutely.
a couple questions that are in
Yeah,
my
yeah.
mind. Okay.
Is there any other questions?
Is that all? Any other questions?
Just one, just George, your time frame and all the way out in November, what about this 45-day moratorium that the supervisors put on? I mean, those dates don't match, so what?
Oh, okay.
What are they gonna do with?
Yeah, that's a good
that?
question. We, in our timeline, we're back at the Board of Supervisors on May 21st for an extension of time
Oh, okay.
moratorium hearing.
Okay.
The board may or may not extend that moratorium. They have the option of extending it for 22 months and 15 days if they so choose. What we very much like, and why we came so quickly to the Planning Commission, is we very much like to get your thoughts and the public's thoughts, so that when we go to that moratorium hearing, that we can present and say, this is what the Planning Commission said at our workshop with regard to community centers that you may want to take into account with regard to whether you extend the moratorium or not.
Okay, thank you.
Any questions over here?
Yeah, I just, on all of this, after reading through it and everything, I get the impression it's more for ag land or residential ag and forestry.
Right,
Right.
right.
All other zonings, just residential, commercial, whatever.
Right.
That is
is
more
what-
of a process, and I know when you talk about like the Ridge or something, that's more of a master plan. So if somebody
Right.
came in and said, hey, I've got 100 acres here and I'm planting residential and
Right.
golf course and whatever on it, you'd probably look at it and process it a little different than what we're talking about, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you know, it's not new, the community center issue. It is, however, coming more to the forefront. I mean, we have had these in the past. We have Emma's Place down by Loomis. We have Newcastle Wedding Gardens around Newcastle. We have the Flower Farm in Granite Bay. We now have 2 more, Wise Villa Community Center and Gold Hill Gardens. Recently, but those have taken place over a long duration. Recently, it seems to be accelerating with wineries and that sort of thing, wanting also to have in conjunction events. And that's really where the discussion started, is like, is it really appropriate to have these sorts of venues in agricultural zone districts? So you are right. You're spot on the money.
Thank you.
Complaints on the existing facility storage, is there a lot of them, or?
There, without giving away names or anything of wineries, there are a few hot spots. A majority of the wineries,
I believe he's talking about existing event centers.
are you talking about
Existing facilities that have been put in under the current.
under the community center? Never.
Are we, no complaints on file?
Newcastle Wedding Gardens, I don't think we've gotten any complaints. The Flower Farm, I'm not sure if we've gotten any formal complaints. I don't believe we have. Emma's Place, I'm not sure. Well, it is an event center. I'm not sure it's operational at this point. So no, we have not gotten any complaints on the previously existing ones. And Gold Hill Gardens and Wise Villa Winery are so new that nothing has happened there.
Thank you.
Okay, Wayne, you didn't have any comment?
George, do you have any pending applicants
Pending for a community
for
center?
community center?
Yeah, one that was put on hold because of the moratorium was Rock Hill Winery. The actual moratorium language said that you had to be deemed complete to continue on in the process, and that application had not been deemed complete. So it's on hold until the moratorium is lifted.
Okay, I have one quick question, and that is, what's the trend in wine growing in Placer County? Are we getting more and more acres of land turned to grapes? You don't hear anybody asking for a cabbage tasting place, but there seems to be the converting of acreage. Do we have any handle on how, a trend, how it's going, or what?
I do not have statistics about how much land is under vineyard. I can tell you what my sense is. I don't know it. I think it's an up and coming issue.
Those are the findings of the agricultural commissioner. Over the last 10 years, the acreage dedicated to wine grapes has grown. I believe the number is approximately 250 acres right now, and that continues to grow on an annual basis.
George, one question, because we're sort of focusing on the wineries, but the difference in Placer County is we have like some of our mandarin farms that are really, really big. I mean,
Right.
compared to the wineries and stuff. And I know there's some of the ones that do special events and everything, and with us talking about this, I mean, I personally could see where all of a sudden, if there's a successful community or event center on a winery, that they would say, okay, if you focused on the wineries but left us out.
Right.
And
That
be it cattle ranching, I mean, we are very diverse compared to a lot of other areas.
And right now, under the current process, we could accommodate that through the use permit process. If someone wasn't a winery, because that's regulated through the winery ordinance, they also have the right to come in for a community center. If as we go through this process, we are funneling these things down, that would be, and that has come up as a question, that would be something that we might need to look at. I'm sorry. That other agricultural endeavors may wish to do this as well. And so we might have to take that into account somewhere in the process, that mandarin farms.
I guess just making one comment on that. I think when we go through this process, I think we have to, at least I would look at it more, if you're in an agricultural zone or agricultural residential, you'd need to take all these into account, because what would be the difference if you're a farmer and you have a winery versus selling kiwis, in winter, and
Yeah, I agree. I could see mandarin farms and other types of
whatever, it could be anything.
of uses that would like to have events and that sort of thing based on the nice mandarin grove and weddings and things. It's something as we go along. Like I said, right now we can accommodate that with our current ordinance. If you had a mandarin orchard and you wanted to have events in a farm zone, you would come in and apply for a community center with a use permit, and we would review it based on its merits. So we've had a mechanism to address that. If we're going to change that mechanism, then that is definitely something that we will have to take into account as we go through the process. But right now, we're just at the very beginning stage.
Okay, any other questions?
One last question, and I don't know whether this is diving too deep into the details. I'm too early on this, but I didn't see in any of what you prepared for us that addresses parking. I think that's probably a pretty big issue on these because, potentially people could be parking on these very narrow roads if there was a large event, which would restrict, traffic and also emergency vehicles from coming in if necessary. So do you require on-site parking?
Yes. We would park, if you're going to have a community center, we would park you like any other commercial use. We would go through the use permit process. That's how we would handle it. We would look at the specific roads which you're going to be using during a traffic study. We would look and see if there's appropriate for people to be parking out on those roads, which in most cases it would not be. And we would make sure that you had safe ingress and egress onto the roads that you were using to access the community center. And we would make sure that you had enough parking on site to accommodate what you're proposing to the standards existing in our zoning ordinance today.
Complete with ADA?
It would have to be ADA compliant, yes.
Maybe one more question.
One more question.
Just to kind of get clarification, we had a director's determination that these community centers should go before the planning commission and not be dealt with like it was a minor use permit. Is that a final decision, or is that really going to be part and parcel of what the decision is going to include here?
Right now, the planning director made that interpretation because it's a minor use permit for community centers. And minor use permits go to the zoning administrator, which I have to thank Mr. Johnson for doing that because I'm also the zoning administrator. And delegated that to you.
Yeah, we like you anyway.
Yeah. While going through this process, if you like that interpretation that these things come before you, you could switch the permit requirement to a conditional use permit.
Okay.
That would be relatively easy to do. And that way, that assures that they get a conditional use permit, and it would always come to you.
Okay, so that would be a consideration on the table
Yes.
in this discussion.
Absolutely.
Okay, if I don't see any other questions, George, good job.
Thank you.
I think at this point, we'll turn to those of you in the public and suggest that if you would like to give us your thoughts on this issue. I'm not going to start out by suggesting we have time limits on each of your time for speaking, but if it gets way out of control and somebody's up here for a long time, I'm going to ask you to shorten it up. So give us your name and your thoughts.
My name's Lori Lewis, and I live at Wise and Gold Hill, and I've been attending all the public hearings, and I've been very vocal, and I just wanted to come to you today and say thank you very much for listening. I've been stomping my feet, and I've been an angry person, but nobody was listening. And recently, Mr. Johnson came out to my residence and actually heard what I hear from the winery, so he understands, hopefully, what I've been dealing with for the last 2 years. My component on the community side, there's a lot of good ideas, but what I would like to see for my reassurance that my peace and quiet will be protected is the enforcement component. What's going to happen if a person with a community center doesn't go with the conditions of his minor use permit? What are my remedies? And if the county retracts his minor use permit, then does that open that up for you guys for legal court time? I mean, let's try and streamline this thing so you guys aren't hearing 20 denials or appeals on the same type of topic. So I think the more funnel we get, the safer you guys are going to be as far as court time and any litigations. But thank you for listening. Thank you, the county, for finally hearing my problem with the music and the winery. I do feel like you guys are listening. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Susan Ames. I live at the corner of Wise and Gold Hill. So I'm between the winery and Gold Hill Gardens, kind of rock and a hard place. Again, I want to thank you. I was very heartened when you came out with the 2 approvals for Gold Hill Gardens, but not the event center. Like Lori, I felt you were listening and thinking. What happened, I'm not quite sure with the appeal. As you know, it was approved, and as far as not getting any complaints, I know people in my neighborhood have already complained about the noise of him doing whatever he's doing with the equipment. It's been terrifying, some of the goat herds. We have llamas, and they're like, what's going on? So I don't think it's going to be any better, but I do appreciate your thoughtfulness, also George and his staff in the staff report. I've got a handout, one for you and one for the Board of Supervisors, so I won't go over it here. The other thing that I wanted to say was Newcastle Wedding Gardens keeps being brought up as an example of what works, and it works, but it works because there's much, much tighter restrictions on them. They can't have amplified outdoor music. They have to have huge parking area. They're on a very easy access road. She has to have the events inside the building. None of that was placed on Gold Hill Gardens, so I don't think you can compare the two. Just something to kind of keep in mind as this goes forward. So I will leave these here, and again, I thank you for listening to us.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Marilyn Jasper, speaking on behalf of Sierra Club and Public Interest Coalition. We, too, are so grateful that you are starting this process, looking into this, wherever it ends up. I mean, we're all going to be participating, but this is somewhat reassuring. In your packet are tons of suggestions from the 4 or 5 letters. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it all, but I think some of those are really valid starting points. Possibly for some of us, commercial entertainment event centers would not be allowed in ag or res zoned areas. They become de facto commercial events or rezoning. You mentioned enforcement. That is such a huge component of all this. I hope it is thoroughly addressed. And the parking. And I happen to live within a mile of one of the community centers, Flower Farm in Loomis. I would say good neighbors. Without our knowledge, without any notice, I should say, a wine tasting room or facility was plopped down on the Flower Farm's property. And they had an event. These things are nice. We're not saying that they're bad, but people did park on Horseshoe Bar Road. There's a part you think, okay, that's not supposed to happen, I'm going to file a complaint. You don't want to be in that. We don't want to be cranky neighbors. We're cranky enough as it is. So I'm saying that you may not get a complaint, but there are violations, and I don't know how all this will paper out or pan out, but I really think strong restrictions, I hope, come out of all these workshops. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Don DuPont. I'm the owner of Rock Hill Winery. And just to give you a little bit of background, I'm actually from Sonoma County. I moved here to Placer County, perhaps naive in that I thought I could spend a couple $1 million and build a really nice winery, and it'd be received as I received well. And as far as I know, it has been. The only negative stuff I've heard is essentially in the local Auburn area. My facility is located off of Sierra College, the first property on the left-hand side where Sierra College and Del Mar intersect. So if I can take you from Interstate 80, where the new Walmart and that big development is going on, according to the Rockland Chamber, I guess is one of the largest in the country. But right there at Interstate 80 off ramp 109 is Sierra College. So you'd pass Taylor, next street's King, and next street's Del Mar. And there's the 140 or 50-year-old palm trees that line Del Mar. If you're familiar with that, my vineyard is to the left. And I built the facility, as I said, perhaps naively, because I'm from Sonoma County where they don't have a wine ordinance, and everything's done on a per case-by-case basis, if I understood George correctly, for use permits if you want to have events. So one of the things that I heard George perhaps mentioned a minute ago is that If the minor use permit is considered on a conditional basis, I don't see any problem with that. Essentially, you get rewarded if you're a good neighbor and you don't irritate your neighbors, and you get chastised or you lose your permit if you become an issue. And I think that's probably your job, is to protect the public. And at the same time, you've got to preserve property rights for people that want to do private events. After all, how do you legislate personal property rights? At any rate, that might be one suggestion you could consider, is a conditional use permit. In my particular case, the county didn't have any problem taking $4,600 in parking fees or traffic fees and a $4,000 permit fee for my application. And then at the Wise Villa hearing at the Board of Supervisors, the question about Rock Hill came up, and they said that I would be exempt and not affected by the moratorium. And the day after I spent about $5,000 expanding the septic system at the county's request for my event center, I got a letter from the county that said, you fall under the moratorium. So it's a little disheartening to spend a couple $1 million and $10,000 in fees and then have them tell you, oh, well, we've changed the rules since we've allowed one winery to get a use permit, especially since my location is essentially commercial. There's other businesses on Del Mar that are commercial, and the traffic's not an issue. Our parking is huge, which is a good point. I think a lot of it boils down to alcohol and their fear of what could happen if people are irresponsible. Josh Hunsinger recently told me that the Mandarin Farm, one of the Mandarin Farms, had an event recently with 1,000 people there. And there was no complaint about that. So I think it's important to verify what I'm saying. If Josh is here, I don't know. I don't think so. But I think that's pretty interesting. There's a certain amount of reluctance about alcohol, and for good reason, and transportation and the concern about narrow roads. But I think it should be looked at on a case-by-case basis, and it's pretty hard to draw a specific overall rule that applies to each one of these facilities. Also, you know, a number of the wineries are already having events. And at one of the recent task force meetings, Michael Johnson mentioned there's been no complaints. So I think if we approach it prudently and with some care, first of all, we are prudent, and I'll tell you why, because we're legislated by the TTB, Tax Trade Bureau, which is alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. We're regulated by the ABC, which is state, and now we got to deal with county legislation or control. Frankly, I'd rather go through federal and state first, or I'd rather deal with that over what I've had to deal with just the county. It's been an unbelievable nightmare. The staff is great to work with, but it seems like there's no direction on which way they're supposed to go. The rules change on a regular basis. If I keep my winery and run it as a winery with a wine ordinance, you can essentially have as many people attend one of your 6 wine events as you'd like, as long as you have a couple of things dealt with. You have to deal with sufficient parking, you have to deal with sufficient ADA issues, and portable toilets. Those are pretty much the only concerns the county had. That means you could have 300-400 people there. If I get a use permit for a winery, according to Lisa Carnahan and whoever told her, as soon as I get that use permit, I'm restricted to the number of people that my use permit allows me. So if I'm lucky enough to get a use permit for, let's say, 200 people, the winery 5 miles away could have 400 people, but I could have 200 people only, when I've got parking and ADA and all the other expenses of a full-fledged business, when the other winery might be a rural winery in a rural area where you'd really want to be careful about traffic. So there's some inconsistencies. It's almost like you wonder who makes these rules up. I've actually listed that on my email a couple times in response to some of the concerns the county's given me. But if you have any questions, I'd be willing to answer them for you. Specifically, I'm in the business. I've got acres of vines. I think the issue, again, is probably more concern about alcohol than it is actually residential agriculture or at what an event center is. On the other hand, I was kind of almost in a humorous way, I heard them say, well, if you have a golf course, right, then you can have, I said, geez, I should have built a golf course. Then I could have had my event center. So, I mean, I'm being sarcastic, but I built a winery with vineyards, and people come there, and I have hundreds of people that come there, and they say, this is beautiful. I'd like to have a 50-year wedding anniversary here. Can I do it? I said, no. It's interesting, the county, Lisa Carnahan gave me a list, gave me a paper and said, here, give me a list of the 6 kind of events you want to have at your wine ordinance, under the wine ordinance. And you can do 6 events and 2 what they call TOEs, outdoor events. And I listed down, well, my wife's a cancer survivor, so I said, well, I want to do a fundraiser for cancer. I want to do a spaghetti dinner for the football team at Del Oro. They went to the state championship. I want to do a luncheon for the home tour that's a fundraiser for elementary schools. We'll do a red and white ball, some different things that are essentially giving back to the community. She looked at the list and said, not one of those items are acceptable. And I said, well, I said, why? And she says, because those aren't wine events. I said, well, every one of these people will be consuming wine. So in order to qualify this kind of narrow definition, you have to have a wine event that promotes, say, a harvest or something like that, as opposed to saying you want to do a fundraiser for leukemia or cancer or Make-A-Wish or any of these other charitable events. So the way I see it, those are private events with a specific group of people and not necessarily a public event. And so there's the confusion, at least for me. Any questions?
Yeah, you got me confused too. Let's see if we can get a little explanation on that. Richard or George, is there some logic involved somewhere?
I will have to look into the issues raised by Mr. DuPont, and I'll defer to other staff, but I am not aware that there's a restriction on temporary outdoor events or events at wineries that they have to be wine-related.
Absolutely, according to the ordinance.
Well, why don't we leave that as an issue? We don't have to, I guess, necessarily
Let me just say this. If that was the case and there was no restriction, then I could just withdraw my application for a event center and just fall under the wine ordinance. But that's not the case. Because the wine ordinance says you can only have wine-related events. If I want to do a cancer fundraiser, I can't do it. So that doesn't make sense.
I think we need to, George, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to chime in. There is a caveat that says they are wine-related events. There is no definition of what wine-related means. There is the potential to have any kind of event on Mr. DuPont's property through the TOE process, which he can get 2 of a year. So that would be an unrestricted event type. With regard to that's one of the issues that has caused the vintners and the winery owners to approach us, is what exactly is an event? That is something that will probably be dealt with as part of the winery ordinance.
Okay, well, I think it's good you brought it up. We'll wrestle
Yeah,
with it
it's
for a
just,
while.
I think it's just not clear, and that's probably what's caused a lot of this stuff. And I think I want to just reiterate, if the wineries are allowed a conditional use permit, which means you can have it taken away if you're not prudent and careful, I think that's probably a pretty good way to approach it. I think at this point, well, there's only 2 people that have been approved at this point, both Wise Villa and Gold Gardens, yeah. So I think that would be a good consideration, and I think everybody in this business is so regulated by the feds and the state that we're awfully careful about what we do anyway. So it's probably less of a concern. If Sonoma County has 400 wineries and don't have a wine ordinance, we're sort of small potatoes compared to that. Okay.
But we're growing.
Not as quick as you think. There's nobody out there foolish enough to come here and spend a couple $1 million like I have, or Grover, and expect to make any return on your money. It's passion. It's not for profit. At the very best, you're going to sell a few $100s a weekend on wine. It's not lucrative.
Okay.
Contrary to what people think, it's a lot of work and not at all lucrative. It's just more passion. I grew up in the Sonoma business, in the wine business in Sonoma as a family member, and that's my passion.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning, gentlemen. My name is Phil Maddox. I'm the owner of Lone Buffalo Vineyards. And I just have some very brief comments. I'm somewhat concerned about the way that this community center issue arose and has become associated with wineries, at least in the public's mind and with certainly with the planning commission or the planning department's mind. I just went through. We recently moved our winery, and at every turn I got the question, do you want to be a community center? I'm here speaking basically for myself and for Lone Buffalo Vineyards, as I think Mr. DuPont is speaking for Rock Hill Vineyards. There is a Placer County Vintners Association, of which we're both members, and at some point in this process, the Vintners Association, I think, is probably going to get involved to offer some input. But what I mainly want to say is that I think, first of all, not all wineries want to be community centers. I can certainly say that from the standpoint of Lone Buffalo, we have no intention to be a community center under any of the definitions that I've seen. We don't intend to do weddings. The events that we do are mainly small and have very little impact. But I think the critical thing here is that we do have a winery ordinance in this county. And as George mentioned, 2 of the 3 counties that he looked at that have winery ordinances regulate community centers at wineries under the winery ordinance. And I think that as we go through this process, we've got to be careful, because we are at the same time taking another look at the winery ordinance, partly on behest of the Vintners Association, and really the county was very amenable to that, because if you read, it is impossible to determine what's an event under that ordinance. But the main point I want to make is that I think the 2 need to be kept separate. They do have common issues, but we have a winery ordinance, and I think that the one thing that's true of all of the wineries that are operating in the county is that they are ag-related, and that issue doesn't come up. We're all doing some sort of an agricultural action. So I think if we wind up getting situations where it's not clear whether we revise the definition of a community center, and then if a winery comes in and applies to be a community center, what do we look at? The definition of the community center, or do we look at the winery ordinance? My concern is that these matters be kept separate, since we do have a winery ordinance, and we certainly have the ability to deal with the issue of a winery that wants to be a community center under the winery ordinance. Thank you.
See, I might have a question here. I guess it kind of came up before where, the big issue here is at least that we're hearing, is primarily related to the farm zone and the residential agricultural zone. And within those zones, in Placer County, there's a big variety of different types of agricultural operations. It's going to be difficult to really probably define what agricultural operations really apply. But I guess what I'm kind of struggling with in my mind is where wineries get a go-ahead, but because of their distinct nature, but some of the other agricultural operations that could benefit, as well as wineries, from having an event center, at least economically, to balance out their program. Where you separate the 2 and you give favor to one and not to the other, that seems to be a problem for me. Do you kind of see what I'm seeing?
I do see what you're talking about, Mr. Johnson, and I, quite frankly, I don't think you can enact one ordinance that will cover everybody. I think that's one of the problems you're going to have to wrestle with in this situation. my point is we already do have in place a winery ordinance that regulates wineries. We don't have a mandarin growers ordinance. We don't have any of these others, and I think if we did, we already have enough laws on the books. And I see that as an issue, but I certainly don't think that the concern that you raise, that wineries should be given any kind of preference as far as being a community center. Certainly speaking for Lone Buffalo, we don't feel that wineries should be given a preference. I think the nature of the business has to be recognized, and the fact that events are a economic necessity in attracting and keeping customers, and that what needs to be regulated is the size and so on, and frequency, and obviously the conditions that make an event work. And the Placer County Vintners Association has made a recommendation to the county in how to deal with that in moving forward on the winery ordinance. And it primarily recognizing that it's very difficult to define an event. What we've suggested is what we looked at is the size of the parcel, the venue in other words, and the number of people. And I think that once you start looking at things in that fashion, then I think you can make a fair decision that works.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Oh, here we go.
Hi, I'm Tina Wilkins. I own Vina Castellano Estate Vineyards and Winery. I think a lot of these issues can be addressed by, and I am speaking just for my winery today. I share a lot of Lone Buffalo's views. I have had many events at my winery over the past, even actually over the last 40 years. We've, as a family, have had many events out at our ranch off of Bell Road. We have, the vineyard is on 20 acres, but the family land is 60 acres, so most of my neighbors are related. So that kind of cuts down on the neighbor complaints a little bit. What we do lack in this county are adequate places to have weddings, anniversaries, things of that nature. I get probably this time of year 5 or 6 calls a week for people wanting to have weddings out at the winery. And we have had weddings, family weddings out at the winery with 400 people with no complaint. But that's my parcel. And I actually, since we've put the winery on there, we've lessened the amount of fundraisers and things of that nature that we've done over the years because we now have a winery and we don't want those problems. Having said that, the traffic in Placer County, the week at every winery, I think, with the exception of the people that want to be community centers, but I think of the 20 wineries, 18 of us would never even discuss anything outside of a winemaker's dinner or a promotional agricultural event if there was enough traffic to sell the wine and make a profitable farm business. That's not the case right now. We're a new region, and we're competing with a lot of these places like Sonoma, and their rules have become more restrictive as they have grown and the problems have come to fruition. And here in Placer County, it seems like we're trying to stop all of these problems that really aren't problems yet. And what we're actually going to do is stop people from starting new wineries. And the problem with that is that wineries are ag. One of the things, the most interesting thing that I thought was said today was said by George when he talked about recreational uses of ag land so long as it bolsters agriculture. I'm a winery who is about agriculture. There's some things that we can do to assure that when somebody puts in a winery, what they're doing is not really putting in a community center under the guise of a winery. So now we have 20 wineries. When we started this whole process, we said, okay, in order to be a winery, you had to have 1 acre of grapes. And that was, I think, necessary in the beginning because it's very daunting to start a bigger vineyard than that when there's no traffic. But now we have 20 wineries. We have not enough traffic, but some traffic. I think we can go to the ag, to look at making farms legitimately farms. And those people that are having these events that would bring more people out to see the ag that's out there, I think that's the way to go about it, is to require, this bigger agricultural requirement to the wineries. Wineries do need to have winemakers events. They do need to have wine-centered events to draw people to their wine clubs. Wine clubs are essential to staying in business. So you do have to have these promotional events, winemakers dinners, but I think limiting the size, saying, okay, this event, if an event has got 500 people, that's something different than having, 50 wine club members for dinner, and where the center of the event is actually the wine, the farming element of it. And the same thing with the mandarin growers or any of these other ranches that may want to have some recreational uses. I think it has to be kind of a case-by-case situation. Look at what the facility is. I'm kind of all over the board here, but it's just, I really feel like the community center issue and the winery center issue should be separate. And that we've done a lot of work on this winery ordinance, and I'd hate to see it all go to waste after putting 13 years of my life into it because of this community center issue, which is completely separate. I'm not against community centers, but I think that they are, if your primary focus is to have non-wine events, then that's something quite different than a farm having events to sustain themselves and promote themselves. And let's see. And I think outdoor amplified music, there's a noise ordinance. So I'm not understanding why that is such an issue because, a couple of times a year we like to have outdoor amplified music. Most of it has nothing to do with my winery. Usually those are family events. If I don't go over the noise ordinance, I don't see how the noise ordinance doesn't regulate a lot of the problems, because that is, I think, the number one issue on a lot of these people's mind. They don't want to hear or feel the farm that's next to them. And there's a certain amount of nuisance that they have to allow, because if we're going to have agriculture in Placer County, we have to recognize ag tourism, because that's where communities as small as ours, that's where farming is going. You're not going to get a lot of kids interested in taking over the ranch if it's not making some money, and just selling agricultural commodities on a small level like we are isn't sustainable. That's it.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Barbara Vineyard, and no, I do not have a vineyard. I just happen to have the name. I happen to know quite a bit about community centers. I have managed Mount Pleasant Hall, or Mount Pleasant Community Center, for the last 10 years. My mother-in-law managed it for about 20 or 30 years before that. And to me, the definition of a community center, and I know George touched a little bit on this, our community center is for the benefit of the community. We do have weddings and anniversary parties there, but we also use the hall for 4-H events completely rent-free. We have a Boy Scout troop that's becoming very active in our area. They have had a couple events there, and in fact, we've had 2 Boy Scouts earn their Eagle Scouts project badge with projects at the hall. One hasn't quite earned it yet, but he's finished his project, and I'll tell you, it's really great. To my way of thinking, that nonprofit community center is what is allowed or should be allowed within that ag zoning. And yes, we do have neighbors next door to our community center, and I'm very, very cognizant of their needs. One of my rules is that any event for weddings and that type of thing, that no music can be heard outside the hall, even from the parking lot after 11 o'clock. And I think that is just to be kind to the neighbors. And yet some of the neighbors who live considerably distant, I think, what do you live about? 2 miles, Joyce? She can sometimes hear music from that hall from her home, when maybe the neighbors next door don't. So I think music is or any noise that is annoying to the neighbors is something that we need to be very cognizant about. I also think that I agree with what I've been hearing about, that the winery ordinance needs to be completely separate from the community center. And I also think that any community center that's proposed within the ag zone has to have, first and foremost, the use of the ag products. And I think building a community center and then producing a farm so you can justify that community center, I think, is like putting the cart before the horse. It should be the ag project there first and then have a way to enhance it perhaps. But it needs to be connected to the agriculture. And yes, I am a farmer, and I've been a farmer all my life. I was born on a farm. And the only outdoor event, by the way, we had, and we had it at our house, probably maybe it was illegal, but we celebrated our 50th anniversary 6 years ago with an outdoor out in our yard. Whether that was legal at that time or not, I don't know, but we had 150 friends and another 50 or so relatives that were there helping us celebrate. So, and oh, we did serve agricultural products. We had beef for dinner, and we raised beef cattle, and we had champagne, but we don't raise that champagne. But anyway, that's just kind of a joke on the side. I do believe that on community centers that are not ag-related should be limited in the size of the people, even those that are ag-related. And maybe on some of these community centers it should be 30 to 50 people at a time under most circumstances, although I know that there should be adequate parking on site. I think the idea of parking on our narrow county roads that are barely wide enough for two cars to pass, let alone having parking on the side, would be very detrimental to the neighborhood. And I think that one of the things that needs to be looked at when you're looking at a venue is how close are those relatives, those neighbors, and how close, what effect is it going to have on the existing neighborhood? Now, if you move into an area and there's a railroad there, you have no right to complain about the railroad. But if the railroad all of a sudden is going to be driving right by your front door, maybe you have a right to complain about that. So I kind of think that's the same thing with any of these events centers, that bringing something into an existing ag residential area where the neighbors are comparatively close to that is a lot different than one, and maybe Via Castellano is a good example. Their winery is actually quite a ways off the main road and isolated, so I think that no matter how loud you turn that music up, Tina, you probably can't hear it from out on Bell Road. Am I right? Yeah. So I think that is part of the size of the parcel and the location of the type of event within that parcel would be extremely important in developing regulations. And I also would suggest timelines, that maybe on most of these things that you should say that, the event doesn't start before a certain time in the morning and finishes by a certain time in the evening, maybe noon to 10 o'clock. I don't know what those guidelines you need, but I think some timeline on those events is important. And there again, for respect of the neighbors. And I hope to goodness that May 21st supervisors meeting does extend the timeline for this moratorium, because I don't see how you can get what needs to be accomplished during that very short timeline that 45 days. And I think your job is difficult, and I'm glad it's not my job. I don't envy you for having the job of trying to put together something that is not 20,000 pages long and yet is succinct enough that everybody understands what it means. And I think I've heard, and I know that enforcement is one of the biggest things that happens, and a good many times when there is a complaint, it's going to happen on a weekend, and we don't have any code enforcement available on weekends, and so that is another problem that could happen out in our rural areas too. So I think that concludes my comments.
Thanks, Barbara.
Let me see. I maybe have a question, Barbara.
Yeah.
The concept of ag-related is, on the surface, is pretty clear, and in the farm zone it makes a lot of sense. But then when you get to trying to define ag-related, like there's kind of one kind where a person has a specific crop, mandarins, and they have an event to help promote their sales of mandarins. That's very clearly related to their individual production of agriculture.
Right.
Then there's another type where somebody has, 20, 30 acres or whatever, and say, let's just use mandarins again. That's a very seasonal crop. And in order to really kind of keep their operation going, they could benefit by enhancing that, say, with an event center or events. And so in that case, it's not directly ag-related, but it is ag-related in the sense that it kind of rounds out the, I guess, the economic or the economy of that particular operation. And so I guess when you're thinking ag-related, what are you thinking, very narrow, or?
I'm pretty narrow on it, yeah. I really am, because of the neighbors. And that, I think, is important. I mean, I almost got down and thanked the good Lord when the property across from us was sold to the Conservancy, so that I know that there's never ever going to be any neighbors with their dogs running loose or leaving my gates and fences open across, so, yeah, I think it's narrow. But I think the consideration for the people who have moved or have lived in the rural areas, partly because of the peace and quiet, that they move there so that they can have quiet, or they live there because, and they, I don't know, if you ever, some of you lived in the rural area, and if you do, you wake up and there's no other noise except the birds and that's to be treasured, and I hate to see people lose that have had it. So.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, please come. He's asking the clerk something.
Good morning and thank you. My name is Patricia Burke. I'm from Newcastle. And I want to speak to the majority of rural Placer, or for the majority of rural Placer residents. We're here for a number of reasons. We're here because we're farmers or ranchers or orchardists. We may have children who we want to have the benefit of 4-H and future farmers. We may be people who are living on land that our parents owned. We may be people who bought their property 50 or 60 years ago and still live there and cherish the rural environment. They could be retirees, keeping chickens and goats in a garden. In short, we're not here to build or use an event center. So I'm asking you to remember us, the majority of the rural Placer residents, when you make your deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Carol Rubin. I also live in Newcastle, a little less than a mile from the Gold Hill Gardens Community Center. I want to approach my comments in two ways. One is with some specific comments about things that have been brought up here today, and then with a more general forest comment at the end. First, I want to thank all of you in the Planning Commission, because I sat through the hearings on Wise Villa Winery Community Center and Gold Hill Gardens Community Center, and I heard you expressing a number of the same concerns that we residents who are going to have to live with these things expressing issues about traffic and density and parking and noise. And I want to thank you for raising those issues. I've put several recommendations that appear in the staff report, and so I'm not going to go through them again. They're there for you to read if you want. I also want to thank Mr. Rosasco, who has sat through innumerable MAC meetings on this issue, and who has been very helpful in heading up this task force to look at this issue in the moratorium, and also acknowledge the rural Lincoln MAC that did hold a special meeting on the community center issue, and I believe you have the recommendations that came out of that meeting in your packet as well. And I'd really encourage you to look at some of those. There were some good ideas presented there. What I'm hoping that we can get out of this moratorium process is to look to the future. There was mention made by Mr. Rosasco and others of the performance criteria and how they're reluctant to apply performance criteria because not one size fits all. But performance criteria can be a set of minimum standards. And any applicant is always free to apply for a variance of those standards. So if you make the minimum parcel size for a community center 20 acres and the applicant only has 18.6 acres, they can apply for a variance. And they might very well get it. But if the minimum parcel size is 20 acres and the applicant only has 8 acres, they're probably not going to get it. And they deserve to know that before they go through the planning process. There's many standards that are set for uses such as this in all zoning that have a high nuisance potential. So there's standards about, where you could put a rock quarry or a dog kennel or an airport. So this would not be unusual to establish a set of standards for an event center. Mr. DuPont raised, I believe, commented that there was a 1,000-person event held and it generated no complaints. And that's certainly possible. A 1,000-person event in the right location might well generate no complaints. On 100 acres off a major thoroughfare, sure. And there has to be a way to account for situations like that. One person made a comment about stopping wineries, and I don't understand this. This is not about wineries. We're not interested in stopping wineries. What we want Placer County to consider is whether there should be large gatherings in rural areas consistently on a week-in, week-out basis for profit. That's what we're looking at. And that ain't ag, okay? Whatever that is, it isn't ag. You might argue that it's associated with ag, but it isn't a winery either. It's quite possible to have a winery and not have a 100-person wedding every weekend. So I would really like to second the point that was raised by Mr. Johnson, Mr. Sevison, and Mr. Denaio about why are wineries singled out for special treatment here. I don't think that there should be an event criterion in the winery ordinance. There should be a separate event ordinance that applies to a winery that wants to hold events. So you shouldn't penalize a cattle rancher or a mandarin farmer for not growing grapes. It just seems to me that there needs to be a little better way of looking at this. So maybe instead of having a community center ordinance and a winery ordinance that regulate events separately, maybe we need to have an agritourism ordinance or an event ordinance that will look at these sorts of applications and their effect on zoning, no matter what kind of agriculture or even no agriculture at all that they might serve. We want, I hope, that you will consider this now, because this is a burgeoning use. We're going to see more of these things because agritourism is very appealing, as several speakers have mentioned. There are going to be right-to-farm conflicts that are going to arise when people who want to hold parties run up against the sights, the sounds, and smells of agriculture. And we want to make sure that agriculture doesn't suffer because somebody has decided that parties are appropriate uses in ag zoning. Also ask you to look to the future to consider that once you've paved over a large swath of these parcels for parking lots and big buildings, you're never going to put a pasture or an orchard back on those places again. And so let's go lightly on the land when we're considering these uses. And if you consider them for ag zoning at all as being appropriate, let's make sure that there's some kind of density or minimum acreage requirement, that they're kept to the periphery where they're serviced by adequate roadways, and that there are safeguards put in for the comfort and the noise of the residents. If you're going to promote agritourism by selling the peaceful country life, you want to make sure that you're not killing that goose that lays those eggs in the process. And people aren't going to come out to see the ag if it's just more suburbia and more traffic jams. For parcels that are not located in an appropriate location, near towns, near major roadways, the county can encourage the formation of co-ops, and other counties do this, where anybody, and it doesn't have to be a wine owner, it could be a rancher or a mandarin grower, can have a tasting room or a restaurant or a party hall that they all share in. And I really think that might be something that would be useful to look at, and maybe we can have it all. We can have agritourism and not threaten ag so much. And I want to thank you again for your attention.
Thank you, Carol. Oh, she's finally made it now. She's gotten up about 12 times. Don't stop now.
Jack in the box for a while, huh? Hello, I'm Teresa Cheney. I live in Newcastle, Gold Hill and Schindler Road, and I want to say how encouraged I am by all of this. What a productive workshop. This has been so cool. Really, really good points have been brought out. I thank you guys. I thank George. I thought did an excellent job summarizing such a complex issue. Very many, many layers to this issue. And so I kind of want to talk about a couple of different things that I've already heard and reiterate some I've heard and sort of make my case for those that I support. And I also would like to, at the end, sort of talk about that 40,000-foot view that one of the women from the Agricultural Commission spoke about, that now becomes our responsibility as we began to see some of this overlap between the winery ordinance and agritourism and the definition of community center and Grange halls. And so we have to take that 40,000-foot event and ask ourselves, are we going to kill the goose that lays the golden egg? So I'd kind of like to address each of those things. One of them, for me, that I'm really enjoying here is that I'm hearing us talk about this as a land use issue. This isn't neighbors versus neighbors. This isn't the angry pitchforks and torches. When Mr. Carson at Gold Hill Gardens was awarded by the Planning Commission after their careful thought and study that he could have guest cottages and that he could have a bed and breakfast, you didn't hear any neighbors going, I didn't get my way, I didn't get my way. They said, more appropriate to the area. There was no squawking. It was this issue with the community center, the events, the outdoor amplified music, all of these things. So you see, I'm so pleased to know that we're working together here as a team to take a look at how we can get this. I think it needs sorting out. I don't think status quo is okay. I know that George, of course, as part of his comprehensive study of what our different options might be as we pursue this problem solving, one of them would be status quo. I don't think it's working. I think we heard that from the Planning Commission themselves. I mean, the Board of Supervisors, they said, oh my God, it took 2 years for Mr. Carson to get a yes or a no, and sometimes it was yes and sometimes it's no, and then the appeal. This is not working. This is inefficient. You guys don't have the tools to listen and hear these things. You guys don't have the definitions. You don't have the guidelines. You don't have the restrictions. You don't even, I think this has so much work to be done just to ensure. Some people say, why are we looking at problems that haven't happened yet? I would hope that's the nature of the word planning. Hello. Do we want to end up like L.A. where the very quality of life that people all rush there for is now ruined? No. So status quo is not going to work. It's not going to work because this case-by-case minor use permit, despite the fact that we are a very diverse county, it's slow, and it's also causing a lot of heartaches for the folks that are interested in dumping millions of dollars like Mr. Pont. They're getting mixed messages. They're getting illogical guidance. They're getting, sometimes I'm hearing that they're investing a ton of money in and making the adjustments required in advance of really getting the permit, if I'm hearing it correctly. I may be naive on this. And then they have a certain amount of weight going before the board saying, but I put all this money into it, and now you're telling me I can't have it. Well, how is that? What's going on here? Everything is cart before the horse. The wrong things are driving this. People are getting frustrated that have good intent. And for me, the thing that I see that just seems to be getting buried in this provision about community center is backing up. This is a farm district, which if you read the intent and purpose of a farm district, it says that it's to provide areas for the conduct of commercial agricultural operations that can accommodate necessary services for agriculture and together with the use of residential land at low densities. So here we are. This is the purpose and intent of the area. As we study this community center definition, let's look at it in terms of its appropriate districts that it applies to and then how it might be executed in those districts. So we don't have to say, oh, Placer County is a diverse area. How are we ever going to come up with this? We've got the districts dividing up that diversity. So we need to have definitions specific to those different districts. And for me, farm zoning and all the folks that signed on for living in farm zoning and have invested in farm zoning and how I'm reading the definition that currently exists, I don't think it's appropriate to have a commercial activity that does not have a primary agricultural component to it. I'm yay okay with wineries. I'm yay okay with agritourism. I like to think that we offer a variety of ways for the mandarin growers and for all these folks to supplement agriculture because, frankly, I don't want to see the demise of agriculture. I want to see it. If it takes supplemental activities to help promote agriculture, please allow them. And let's use discretion and let's use good guidelines. Let's not do it in a way in which we're swallowing up agricultural land that will be lost, never to be agriculture again. The agricultural primary component needs to be first and foremost, and this is why the Agricultural Commission said no twice to Gold Hill Gardens prospect, was because it really never did claim to have a primary agricultural component. And yet it's to no fault of anyone's because basically the definition wasn't necessarily have any requirements. So no, I think we need to have performance standards, absolutely. I don't think we get to go from here and say, well, we'll just continue to do the minor use project. And so folks like poor Mr. DuPont invest money and then 2 years later finds out you're on hold. No, this is ineffective, it's ineffectual. I think we have the wherewithal, the little creative problem solving, to address the diversity of the county, to address the diversity of the needs, to help support agriculture with its required component that maybe it has off-season, events that are appropriate. It's more about land use. Where is that appropriate? On main arterial roads, possibly, or maybe on large size acreage. It's helpful. But we also want to see evidence that the primary focus is agricultural operation. That's what folks here signed on for. That's what all of you signed on for. And the wineries, my assessment, I know my peers may feel differently on this, but I think the wineries are agriculture. There you go. Let's try to help those wineries. I'm good with it. Now there is some enforcement problems. That's separate. It doesn't mean that the wineries and maybe those things that it requires for them to be sustainable shouldn't be welcome. I'm good with it, personally. But I just more think that that's more of an issue of code enforcement. And I also think in some ways the winery ordinance does need a little bit of special attention from, say, the community center thing, because it has that component Mr. DuPont spoke about alcohol. It kind of has a special, it has its own special considerations. But I also think that if you take that 40,000-foot view that the woman was talking about, in which we look at the purpose and intent of the district, and then we ask ourselves, what is appropriate land use for a community center? There's no way you can answer that without it having a primary agricultural operation as the driving thing that any other subsequent things help to sustain it. Now, it's going to still mean some definitions. We're going to need definitions about what is a primary operation. What makes it primary? Is it the volume of wine produced? Or, unfortunately, it's going to be snarly. But I think it's going to be more snarly if we don't set down those performance standards, those performance restrictions, the minimum acreage size, the scale, the saturation, how many per 6 miles, how many per 4 miles, whatever. I think it's going to be much snarlier. And I think it's going to discourage folks that might want to enter into an operational business or an agritourism business when they know that there's illogic and unfairness, in your words, Mr. DuPont, across the board. The winery ordinance allows this, but because it's too restrictive, I'm going to apply for an event center thing. We need to have some continuity. We need to look at them next to each other. I'm real pleased we're looking at the winery ordinance almost simultaneously to this because there is, of course, it evokes a lot of those questions. So I've got a paper that I put together in terms of some of my recommendations in terms of the performance standards. But more importantly, I just want to underscore that I think we need to put those out forth. I think it would make everything more comfortable. I think the Planning Commission would have the tools, the Planning Department would have the tools to be able to use good judgment. Again, I like to underscore what Carol said about that we can address our diversity not only in good thinking up front, but also in the fact that variances seem to be kind of a standard course for folks in this county. I mean, they get a lot of variances because there's a lot of variety, and we want to customize each of our permits and requests for the best. So the other thing is I wanted to, I guess that's about it. I'm going to pass to you guys these guidelines that I just, took a look at in terms of helping to ensure that this does sustain agriculture, because that's what the district was designed for, that and low residential densities. So yeah, I guess that's just my big point.
Thank you. How many more people would care to speak today? 1, 2, 3. Okay.
I'll be short.
Let's try to, I don't want to cut you short, but try to speed it up just a little bit if we can. Thank you.
I'm Dr. Grover Lee, owner of Wiseville Winery. I thought I'd just give everyone a quick update since we've been approved as a community center. Our events are limited to 100 people. We haven't had one of those yet. Our registration system, we've been cutting it off at 50 because that's what we feel comfortable handling. And so all of our events since we've been approved have been at 50. Our reservation cuts it off. I've prepared 10 acres on another parcel that I own for another 10 acres of grape vineyards. Since I've been approved, since I actually know that it looks like it's going to be viable to actually grow grapes. So the 16 acres of grapes that I have right now are looking beautiful because of my spacings that I use in my vineyard. Instead of a typical 12-foot wide rows and 10-foot apart, most of my vineyard is 8 by 5 or 4 by 4. So I probably have closer to 35 or so acres of grapes on my 16 acres, which I'm adding another 10 to that. Since our kitchen has been fully approved as a commercial kitchen, we are now serving food at our winery, and we're buying all of our food. About 90% of our food is coming within 5 miles of the winery. So we're getting food from Loomis right down the street, and but down by Lincoln, our beef, our pork, our lamb, vegetables are coming off of a commercial grower that's less than a mile from me. That's all. We talk about that as part of our education. We don't have servers, we have educators. Our educators talk about where that food came from, how it's being prepared. If it's not in season, we don't serve it. All of our you cannot come in and order food without wine. It is a food and wine pairing, and we educate both on the wine and the food. We have a very, very active educational process in the vineyard, in the winery, and about 50% of the people that come to the winery take advantage of that tour through the vineyard, discussing what goes into growing a vineyard, what goes into producing grapes, what those grapes do when they enter the winery. Part of that continues, that education continues when they go into the bistro, where the education takes place on the food and the food component, where that came from, who the grower is, what the process was. So I just wanted to give you an update to the people. By the way, our music that was caused all this problem. Yes, our Spanish guitar player can play as loud as he wants to. Our cello and violin players can play as loud as they want to. This weekend we'll have our violin and cello players for this weekend. Next weekend will be our Spanish guitarists. So every Sunday we have live music and our bistro is available. So I just wanted to let everyone know what's happened to Wise Villa, and that's what we're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Interesting.
My name is David McEnroth. I live in Newcastle and currently am the president of the Newcastle Community Association. And recently this matter was just brought to our attention, the Community Association. Not that it hasn't been discussed before, but I currently became president and therefore kind of getting involved in this and learning for the first time what you're doing here to some degree. And the thing that stands out to us of some concern is calling these community centers, that word community. We're part of the Newcastle Community Association, and then all of a sudden a private enterprise comes in and sets up in an ag area and call it a community center. There's no discussion with us. We work out of the downtown Newcastle area, and we think of that as the community. So the word community being tied to this center, when it's nothing more than an event center run by a commercial enterprise, should be characterized what it is. And so the concern about definition is all I'm speaking to here, that you change that to event centers as opposed to community centers, because there are a lot of other community organizations that are serving the communities, and these are not their centers of which they're operating out of, and it's very confusing to our constituents as to where our center is. Our center is in the town of Newcastle, and we operate out of that location at the elementary school there in particular, and to suddenly have another organization come in and start calling themselves a commercial enterprise as a community center, I think the word community should be deleted and call it what it is. It's an event center, and if it's a commercial enterprise, then be characterized accordingly to the public. And that's my input to you.
Thank you.
Thank you for hearing us. My name's Carol Owens, and my husband and I have lived off of Schindler Road for 57 years now. And I would just like to say our roads are old mining roads, and they're not made for all of this cars that they say they're going to have on these events. And I would just like to say that we need to preserve our rural way of life a little bit anyway, and these roads are not made for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else? Going, gone. Okay, thank you all for your comments. I think they were all well thought out, and I think we all got a lot of good information from you. I guess at this point, I would assume staff is going to look for some direction on not only what they've heard, but what they want to suggest back to the Board of Supervisors on how we feel about all this.
That would be the appropriate action should the commission choose. As Mr. Rosasco noted, this issue will be presented to the Board of Supervisors at its May 21st meeting. It was staff's hope that we could provide some guidance and direction from the Planning Commission, not necessarily a conclusion or an ultimate direction, but just some thoughts and ideas on how best to move forward at this point in time.
Well, I think you're probably going to get 6 different suggestions here pretty quickly, and I'm not exactly.
Chairman?
Well, no, mine's just one of the 6. But I think we've heard some good ideas and some good suggestions, and I'm not sure that I'm prepared to put my feet in concrete just yet. I would like personally, and I guess I shouldn't speak first, I should let everyone else speak first, but I think some of the suggestions that we've heard today are something that we should truly look at strongly. I mean, maybe separating the issues completely and having an ordinance for these special uses and keeping the farm separate. Maybe that makes a lot of sense. That kind of appealed to me, I don't know. But it's going to take a little time to let staff think about this and figure out how to best put it in words, and along with Jerry Cardin, make it legal. And I don't know. I guess I should shut up and let someone.
Oh, and to that end, as set forth in your staff report, staff has identified possible next steps that includes reaching out to the community for additional input and guidance. And so if it's the pleasure of the commission, you can recommend to the Board of Supervisors that you recommend that staff move forward with the steps identified in your staff report.
Okay. Is there, I'm sure others comment.
Yeah, I think that's what we should recommend, is that staff has laid out a time frame. It looks like it's appropriate for more input. We just had the people here today that could make it, and what I heard was a lot of good comments, but I guess the thing to stand out is we need standards, whatever they may be, and we need enforcement. I mean, I'll leave it at that, but so I think just because of that, and the way I feel about standards and enforcement, would be enough reason for me at least, to recommend to the Board of Supervisors that they direct staff to proceed with their evaluation and their schedules they have outlined here in our memo today.
Anyone else?
Well, I guess I do have some thoughts, and I think I brought up, a few of them already, where maybe it boils down to when we start looking at different categories of community centers that they're distinguishable. We have the big scale stuff that I talked about earlier with the golf course and that kind of stuff, but then also the wineries and the other agricultural operations. I know another thought I have is not so much the government facilities like schools, but where you define, what do you call it, NGO or non-commercial event centers, say, from, or not event centers, community centers from profit-making community centers. That, I don't have an answer for that, but, it's kind of how you really distinguish those. And I guess my thought would be you got to look at the impact, maybe more than whether, how the money's handled or whether somebody's making a profit off of it. And, an example would be with hospitals. I think, like Sutter Hospital up here is a nonprofit. I don't know if Kaiser's profit. I suspect it's profit. But to the general public, everybody thinks they're hospitals. They don't distinguish between which one is profit and which one is not profit. So, I'd be a little leery of defining the difference between profit and nonprofit and focusing more on just what the impact of the events are going to be. And so there's, I think, a lot of details there, and a lot of good ones have been brought up today, but there seem to be some themes in terms of what's acceptable. The idea of, and I don't have an answer to this one either, I know a lot of people wanted agricultural benefit to be very narrowly defined. And on the other hand, I can see where if somebody can have another economic activity on their farm that allows them to keep their farm intact, there's a benefit in that too. So, these are issues that I think as we move through this, we're going to have to sort through. But I also would be a little bit reluctant to get too narrow on this, because as proposals come forward and we have too tight guidelines, then the discretion on particularly the Board of Supervisors becomes less, and we need to be guarding against that. So those are just some thoughts.
Okay, thanks, Richard.
I think I'm in agreement. Profit is not a dirty word, and it probably shouldn't be relevant to whether anything gets approved or not. It should be approved on the merits of the project. Whether somebody intends to make a profit off it or not is, I can't see the relevance of that issue, of that part of it. The other part that I see lacking, and I see it lacking not only with the event centers and the wineries and that, but with several of the county ordinances in general, is that it seems like most of the violations, whether it be noise ordinance or whatever, occur in the hours when there's no enforcement available. And I think that needs to be a separate issue looked at, not necessarily in relation just to these, but into county ordinances in general.
Okay, thanks, Jeffrey. Anyone else?
Okay, I guess
Ken?
my comment on it, and I keep hearing it, the community center versus event center, and I think a community center, and I think, downtown in Sacramento, where they have their big community center down there and they do all the events, but the zoning on that is completely different from what we have here. Now, I could see where the county could put in a community center, but maybe keep it in the appropriate area and just rename what we're doing event centers, and it can be ag event centers and agricultural zones, and maybe break it down, do a couple different ones. And then on the other issues, I think, Jeff, you sort of said some of the things I said, and I think Rich brought up some of the things, but I think we need to look at it different than the way it is now.
I've been really impressed with today. I mean, again, I thought there was some very articulate thought that went into a lot of the presentations that were given today and people's comments. I was really impressed too, somebody mentioned it as well, as the Lincoln MAC. They really dug into this deep, and they came up with some really good suggestions of things that should be reviewed in this whole process, and I think a lot of them have merit. I'm going to agree with Jeff, certainly on enforcement. It's a big issue, You can't call the sheriff and they won't deal with that. I mean, they may deal with it to some degree, but they're not going to deal with it in the way that it should be. I do like the idea that was suggested about having them under a conditional use permit. I think that holds a club over these folks to do the right thing, to follow the guidelines, so I think that's something that should be considered. I have to tell you that I am biased. I have been on the receiving end of a for-profit event center, and it caused nothing but aggravation, and most of it was related to noise. They would have events. It was a place that just had weddings, and it was near us. We lived in Black Oak off of Dry Creek, and it was at the Red Hawk Ranch, and it was illegal. They were not supposed to be doing it, but they did it anyway. And the sound from that event just radiated, and they would go to all hours of the night. And so I have a bias that these types of events do not fit in a rural environment. Flat out, they do not. I'm okay. I understand wineries and other ag-related sort of activities in rural areas. I don't have an issue with that. But I believe if you're just going to drop a specific wedding operation right in the middle of a community, especially where there's a low-density sort of area, it doesn't work. And through all these hearings, you're going to hear me saying that, because I just have a very strong feeling about that, because I've lived through it. I don't like it. It's horrible. Our neighbors had to deal with it as well, and it was just aggravating. So.
Sounds like you might be a little prejudiced, Wayne.
I'm very prejudiced, Larry.
Okay, well, I don't think any of us disagree with you necessarily there at all.
Let me ask a question. Did staff want a motion that we forward these comments that we received both in writing and verbally today, and propose that they do go ahead with that schedule?
Yeah, that would be great. We would love.
Well, I'll make that motion then.
But could I recap quickly? I just want to tell you what I heard, to see if I heard the same thing from the commission. I heard that you definitely like us to look at redefining or looking at different definitions for community centers and event centers, but not so much based on profit or nonprofit, based on land use impacts. I also got a feeling that you'd like us to look at specific criteria with regard to where community centers can and can't go. Performance standards to put criteria.
Maybe definition there.
And enforcement.
Yeah.
Enforcement's a big issue, yeah.
Enforcement is a separate issue. Again, you happen to be lucky because I'm also the supervisor of code enforcement. And I know,
Where's your gun?
Yeah, I know. This is why I got the job. I cover the gambit. Oh, it is absolutely true about enforcement that these things happen on the weekend, and it's very hard to verify after the fact. We have been in discussions about ways that we may be able to address that. We've come up with some, what I think, I'm not prepared to disclose it, but very good ideas that would address these things. It's in its infancy. It's in its infancy.
Changing people's work schedules. They get Monday and Tuesday off instead of Saturday and Sunday.
Well, no, it would be. It would.
Come on. Hey, that's too easy.
My employees.
No, it would result in enforcement capability on the weekends and that sort of thing. So when these things do come in, they would be done. But I don't want to digress. Mostly what I heard was we need to look at performance standards, and you're definitely interested in redefining these more specifically based on land use.
So, say, George, can I respond to that a little bit?
Yes.
I think we need to look at the performance standard concept, but, I think we also have to be prepared to moderate ourselves, because the purpose of a commission and a board of supervisors is to be able to consider these things on a case-by-case basis. And if we get too detailed into the performance standard criteria, then, there could be some real dragons that come up that the supervisors, or the planning commission supervisors really aren't able to deal with. So
Right.
I throw up a caution on the performance standards, but say, okay, let's look at them, but, in the end, we got to be a little careful on that.
What I would tell you just quickly in response, and it occurred to me when Ms. Rubin was speaking, you could have some performance standards which are minimum performance standards, and if people didn't meet those standards, then you could have a second provision that said that they would need to go into the use permit process if they were non-standard. I heard variances talked about a lot of times. My suggestion about that would be that is probably not the best entitlement to handle that with. That's for exceptions based on special circumstances, where a use permit is you look at something based on its merits and make a determination if it's consistent with surrounding uses. So as we go along here, that's something that we can definitely vet more. If you want some minimum standards, and if they don't meet those minimum standards, and maybe for good reason, you could move them into the use permit process. Okay. So there's all sorts of ways to address that.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Do you think, I'm sorry. I was just going to say to staff, do they think they have enough information to go back to the board and obviously recommend that they continue their moratorium until more of this can be done?
Yeah, there has been plenty of information provided by the commission.
Yes.
Oh, okay, so because that 45 days, if the clock's been ticking already, is, even for you, that's a pretty short window?
It was a very short window. Commissioner Tanayo. I've been to a MAC and written 2 staff reports in the last 45 days.
Yeah, maybe add that in there, that, the time it takes.
Well, let me ask you, you want a motion directing you, or do you feel you have direction already?
This is a workshop, so it's really not appropriate to have a motion come out of here. We have sufficient direction from the commission that we will forward onto the board at its May 21st meeting.
Okay. Are there any other closing comments that anyone would like to make? I think it was a good workshop, actually.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.
I appreciate the people coming out.
Yeah, really got great input.
Well, if there's no further comment, we'll close the hearing. Thank you all.